Episode 130. If either Snape or McGonagall found these instructions peculiar, they hid their confusion. Both turned at once and left the office. Dumbledore walked over to the trunk with 7 locks, fitted the first key in the lock, and opened it. It contained a mass of spellbooks. Dumbledore closed the trunk, placed the second key in the second lock, and opened the trunk again. The spellbooks had vanished. This time it contained an assortment of broken sneakoscopes, some parchment and quills, and what looked like a silvery invisibility cloak. Harry watched, astounded, as Dumbledore placed the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th keys in their respective locks, reopening the trunk and each time revealing different contents. Then he placed the 7th key in the lock, threw open the lid, and Harry let out a cry of amazement. He was looking down into a kind of pit, an underground room, and lying on the floor some 10 feet below, apparently fast asleep, thin and starved in appearance, was the real Mad-Eye Moody. His wooden leg was gone. The socket, which should have held the magical eye, looked empty beneath its lid, and chunks of his grizzled hair were missing. Harry stared thunderstruck between the sleeping Moody in the trunk and the unconscious Moody lying on the floor of the office. Dumbledore climbed into the trunk, lowered himself, and fell lightly onto the floor beside the sleeping Moody. He bent over him. Stunned, controlled by the imperious curse. "Very weak," he said. "Of course they would have needed to keep him alive. Harry, throw down the impostor's cloak. Alistair is freezing. Madame Pomfrey will need to see him, but he seems in no immediate danger." Harry did as he was told. Dumbledore covered Moody in the cloak, tucked it around him, and clambered out of the trunk again. Then he picked up the hip flask that stood upon the desk, unscrewed it, and turned it over. A thick, glutinous liquid splattered onto the office floor. "Polyjuice potion, Harry," said Dumbledore. "You see the simplicity of it, and the brilliance. For Moody never does drink except from his hip flask. He's well known for it. The impostor needed, of course, to keep the real Moody close by, so that he could continue making the potion. You see his hair." Dumbledore looked down on the Moody in the trunk. "The impostor has been cutting it off all year. See where it is uneven? But I think in the excitement of tonight, our fake Moody might have forgotten to take it as frequently as he should have done. On the hour, every hour. We shall see." Dumbledore pulled out the chair at the desk and sat down upon it, his eyes fixed upon the unconscious Moody on the floor. Harry stared at him too. Minutes passed in silence. Then, before Harry's very eyes, the face of the man on the floor began to change. The scars were disappearing. The skin was becoming smooth. The mangled nose became whole and started to shrink. The long mane of grizzled gray hair was withdrawing into the scalp and turning the color of straw. Suddenly, with a loud clunk, the wooden leg fell away as a normal leg regrew in its place. Next moment, the magical eyeball had popped out of the man's face as a real eye replaced it. It rolled away across the floor and continued to swivel in every direction. Harry saw a man lying before him, pale-skinned, slightly freckled, with a mop of fair hair. He knew who he was. He had seen him in Dumbledore's Pensieve, had watched him being led away from court by the Dementors, trying to convince Mr. Crouch that he was innocent. but he was lined around the eyes now and looked much older. There were hurried footsteps outside in the corridor. Snape had returned with Winky at his heels. Professor McGonagall was right behind them. "Crouch," Snape said, stopping dead in the doorway. "Barty, crouch." "Good heavens," said Professor McGonagall, stopping dead and staring down at the man on the floor. Filthy, dishevelled, Winky peered around Snape's legs. Her mouth opened wide and she let out a piercing shriek. "Oh, Master Barty! Master Barty, what is you doing here?" She flung herself forward onto the young man's chest. "You is killed him! You is killed him! You is killed Master's son!" "He is simply stunned, Winky," said Dumbledore. "Step aside, please. Severus, you have the potion." Snape handed Dumbledore a small glass bottle of completely clear liquid, the Veritaserum with which he had threatened Harry in class. Dumbledore got up, bent over the man on the floor, and pulled him into a sitting position against the wall beneath the faux glass, in which the reflections of Dumbledore, Snape, and McGonagall were still glaring down upon them all. Winky remained on her knees, trembling, her hands over her face. Dumbledore forced the man's mouth open and poured 3 drops inside it. Then he pointed his wand at the man's chest and said, "Reanimate." Crouch's son opened his eyes. His face was slack, his gaze unfocused. Dumbledore knelt before him so that their faces were level. "Can you hear me?" Dumbledore asked quietly. The man's eyelids flickered. "Yes," he muttered. "I would like you to tell us," said Dumbledore softly, "how you came to be here. How did you escape from Azkaban?" Crouch took a deep, shuddering breath and then began to speak in a flat, expressionless voice. "My mother saved me. She knew she was dying. She persuaded my father to rescue me as a last favor to her. He loved her as he had never loved me. He agreed. They came to visit me. They gave me a draught of polyjuice potion containing one of my mother's hairs. She took a draught of polyjuice potion containing one of my hairs. We took on each other's appearance." Winky was shaking her head, trembling. "Say no more, Master Barty! You is getting your father into trouble!" But Crouch took another deep breath and continued in the same flat voice. "The Dementors are blind. They sensed one healthy, one dying person entering Azkaban. They sensed one healthy, one dying person leaving it. My father smuggled me out disguised as my mother in case any prisoners were watching through their doors. My mother died a short while afterwards in Azkaban. She was careful to drink polyjuice potion until the end. She was buried under my name and bearing my appearance. Everyone believed her to be me." The man's eyelids flickered. "And what did your father do with you when he had got you home?" said Dumbledore quietly. "Stage my mother's death. A quiet, private funeral. That grave is empty. The house elf nursed me back to health. Then I had to be concealed. I had to be controlled. My father had to use a number of spells to subdue me. When I had recovered my strength, I thought only of finding my master, of returning to his service." "How did your father subdue you?" said Dumbledore. "The Imperious Curse," Crouch said. "I was under my father's control. I was forced to wear an invisibility cloak day and night. I was always with the house elf. She was my keeper and carer. She pitied me. She persuaded my father to give me occasional treats, rewards for my good behavior." "Master Barty! Master Barty!" sobbed Winky through her hands. "You